Hello.
Hey, y'all, so we're going to get started in just another minute or so. So welcome to everyone that is coming in for the Northeast LGBT Conference panel and performance that's happening this afternoon. So I'm going to give us one more minute before we get started. And I can't physically see all y'all, but I can sense that we got some people coming into the room. So I'm excited for everyone to kind of, hear everything that's going to happen this afternoon, especially in the midst of so much energy and so much stuff. I'm excited to be able to discuss some really important shit today and to give us some space to breathe a little bit. Um, yeah, so we'll get started in one more minute, y'all. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started. So welcome, everyone. So it is 3 o'clock on a little bit after 3 o'clock on the East Coast. I'm over here on the West Coast. I think our featured poet for today is over in Central Time in the magical land of New Orleans. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Good stuff. And so what's going to happen, y'all, just so y'all know what the lay of the land is. So we're going to, in a second, I'm going to introduce our feature poet for today. We're going to share some poems, and then we're going to get into a discussion. For those of you that don't know me yet, my name is Jay Mace III. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm going to introduce the amazing Frequency, who's going to bless us with some magical poems for today. Yes! And so whether you're watching on the Zoom, for those of us that are doing tech and other things on the Zoom, you can feel free to type in the chat. For those watching on YouTube or on Expo, y'all can feel free to chat and just give a yes, give a hey, give a clap, give a snaps, whatever it is that you need to make sure that we know that you hear us, that you're with us, and that you understand what's going on. And if there's something that you like, so let us know if there's something that you like. If there's something that mutually makes you frustrated, there's something that makes you feel something. So let us know that too. And if you have any questions, the tech team will make sure they get those to us. So even though we are not with you on the YouTube directly, they will make sure that they get any kind of questions or comments to us. Okay? So let's get into it. So one day, Frequency Katwiwa, how am I pronouncing your last name? Actually, if I can get, say again?
Katwiwa.
Okay, Katwiwa, I want to make sure I'm getting it correct. Is a Kenyan immigrant, queer woman storyteller, the 2018 Women of the World Poetry Slam champion, a 2017 TED Woman speaker, and ranked third at the 2015 Individual World Poetry Slam. Frequency is a highly sought after performer, host, social justice teaching artist, and workshop leader. Rooted in various global communities and having spent their life at the intersection of arts, education, and activism, they and/or their work in reproductive justice, hashtag Black Lives Matter, organizing and activism, LGBTQ+ advocacy, and writing have been featured on The Independent, The New York Times, OK Africa, Upworthy, TEDx for Harriet, Teen Vogue, Huffington Post, Everyday Feminism, and other outlets. Frequency is a founding co-chair of the New Orleans chapter of the Black Youth Project 100, a founding committee member of the New Orleans Youth Open Mic Festival coordinator for the New Orleans Youth Poetry Festival, a blogger with Afro Fashion and Culture, New Orleanians, and a member of Wild Seeds, the New Orleans Octavia Butler Emergent Strategy Collective. Okay, and so I think bios are really great, but also what we know is I know that even with a bomb-ass bio like that, you're going to be way more impressed even by the work that they're going to spit for you today. So I'm really excited for y'all to see Frequency live and in charge and all that. And so if we could please put our digital hands together for the amazing, the talented, the wonderful Frequency.
Thank you, Jay Mace. I really appreciate this invitation and the introduction and just the opportunity to be in this space. I had a different set that I'd prepared that I think just had to shift because of the moment that we're in. But I'll give you the first half of what I'd prepared, and then I'll shift to where I think just needs to be spoken to in the moment, particularly around this panel that is around forging our futures. So the last week or so, I've been talking a lot to my best friend. I always talk a lot to my best friend, but it's in the context of state failure to really show up for people, particularly Black people. It's been really interesting to see the people who are the most prepared for this. A lot of them are queer people who are in community with other queer people because we've already been living lives that are understanding that the state is not protecting of those of us who it sees having renegade bodies or renegade ways of being, even though we're the ones who are actually modeling ways of being that will actually carry us forward into the future. So this first piece is just, it's dedicated to my best friend and just the ways that they've shown up. And we might not use the language of mutual aid or this or that, but we know what it means to show up for each other in ways that also hold our full selves and our humanity. So called for Samia, my sister who's not my sister. 1, you know me in a way that only a sister could or should, and yet you are not my sister. In fact, not a woman. You're a reminder how foolishly people draw borders around their being only to question why they feel so trapped in their own skin. I have no words to tell you what you've been in my life, but I do know a spirit so ethereal should never seek something as worldly as language to describe it. What worth are words whose meaning change over time and tongues? How can mere letters turn themselves into the marvel that you've been in my life? Thank you. Do you remember the time, or all those times, that I locked myself in my room, suffocating beneath the blankets and other people's expectations? Do you remember how your knock cracked the door and breezed in a gentle reminder I needed to exist? Do you remember the days, and there were so many of them those years, when I needed more than a reminder, and you blew the door off its hinges with whatever force was necessary? Love, fear, joy, thank you. You indigo child, do you see how you stay in the world with your beauty? Your Midas touch is beating. You give it to everything that you behold. You are firstborn of the in-between. one who honors the expansiveness of all instead of the confines of choosing the self. You who reminds me that a house is not a home until its foundations have been shaken by the laughter of the living. You who have always been like a sister, have always felt like a sister. Thank you. You have been the closest thing to family I have in a land so foreign when I survey the geography of self. They say if you love something, let it go. But you taught me if you love something, let it grow. Thank you. So grow, my sister, who's not my sister. Grow freely. Be everything you've been for me and others for yourself first. Friend, lover, witness. Give yourself the gift of self. You're the most deserving of such a beautiful thing. And I share this poem in particular too, because it was written somewhere around 2017, 2018, that I would say, when I was deep in the midst of the first wave of organizing for Black Lives Matter stuff. And there was so much that was happening externally, and the people who were really holding space for me in my life were my queer community, people who knew the complexities of what it meant to be visible yet invisibilized, always a threat, even though you're never quite seen. And this next piece that I'm about to do is a piece that I had to write because sometimes you just have to laugh your way through the pain. You have to really look at the ridiculousness of this moment and say, there's nothing else you could really do but laugh and tear this shit down and build something new. And thinking about how many of us are just so trapped in these different narratives of what it means to be human being that actually removes us from our own inherent humanity. And so this is something that I wrote as I was traveling a lot. And I tend to present a lot more masculine when I travel, and the reactions that I was having and the reactions that people tend to have to Black masculine presenting bodies was something that I was really contending with. And I think that we're all contending with in this moment, particularly when there's a queer representation of that masculinity. So I wrote this piece as a way for me to process what it meant to move through the world in that skin. And usually it's a call and response poem, so it might be a little strange to be doing it by myself, but I'll imagine that y'all are responding. And it's called Your Masculinity is So Fragile. Your masculinity is so fragile, it would starve in a house made of kitchens. It seems to only know how to make meals of people's bodies. It thinks Mr. Clean is a real live person. It is still telling people that the air is suddenly dusty every time you watch Set It Off, instead of just admitting that that shit is sad and it made you cry. Your masculinity is so fragile, it thinks getting a compliment from a man makes him or you gay. So fragile, it thinks you need to be a dick or have one in order to be a man. So fragile, when a woman tells you no, you hear try harder. When she tells you she is a man, you learn to recognize restraint. Your masculinity is so fragile, it thinks gift wrapping catcalls with compliments means women should receive them as gifts. So fragile, it becomes a Grinch or a gun if they don't. So fragile, it would shatter under the weight of the truth that it's not helping anyone, especially yourself. Your masculinity is so fragile that when it shatters, you'll still expect a woman to clean it off the floor. So fragile, it'll raise a voice if she doesn't do it quick enough. So fragile, it'll raise a fist if she doesn't do it right. So fragile, we must eventually deal with the fact that this world, it makes men hard because it's far less complicated than allowing them to just be human. So fragile that when it shatters, and if you're lucky, it will eventually shatter. It will die a heavy thing, having consumed so much of your being and so many messages about what it should be. But on that day, I look forward to finally meeting you. These last pieces that I'll share, I'm just going to read them straight from this book that, honestly, it's depressing to me. I published this book in 2015, and in the last couple of days, I've seen the words reappear in so many online spaces, and the fact that they continue to remain so relevant is both it's just a reflection of this time in a way that I don't want my work to ever be relevant like this for this long. And so my goal is at some point that this work becomes irrelevant. We do not have to keep writing poems like this. And I will not introduce the poems. I hope that they'll just speak for themselves. And if you're interested in reading the rest of the book, I'm sure you can find your way to it. So this one's called The Joys of Motherhood. I've always wanted to be a mother. Growing up, I heard all about the joys of motherhood. I used to dream of watching my womb weave wonder into the world. But now, I'm 23 years old, and I don't know if I have what it takes to stomach motherhood in this country. Over the years, America has taught me parenting than any book on the subject. It's taught me how some people give birth to babies and others to suspects. Has taught me that this body will birth kin who are more likely to be held in prison cells than to hold college degrees. There is something about being Black in America that has made motherhood seem complicated. Seem like I don't know what to do to raise my kids right and keep them alive. Or tell my son not to steal because it is wrong or because they will use it to justify his death. I tell him that even if he pays for Skittles and sweet tea, there will still be those in the neighborhood that will watch him and see a criminal before a child, who will call the police and not wait for them to come? Do I even want the police to come? Too many Sean bells go off in my head when I consider calling 911. I will not take it for Oscar granted that they will not come and kill my son. So we may have gotten rid of the nooses, but I still consider it lynching when they murder Black boys and leave their bodies to rot in the sun. It's a historical reminder that there is something about being Black in America that made motherhood sound like morning. Sound like one morning I could wake up and see my son as a repeat of last week's story. Sound like I could wake up and realize the death of my daughter wouldn't even be newsworthy. You can't tell me that Sandra Bland was the only Black woman whose violence deserved more than our silence. What about our other dark-skinned daughters in distress whose deaths we have yet to remember? What about our children whose lives don't fit neatly between the lines of your genders? Apparently, nothing is a protector if you come out of a body that looks like this. There is something about being Black in America that has made motherhood sound like something I'm not sure I look forward to. I've written too many poems about dead Black children to be naive, about the fact there could one day be a poem written about my kids. I do not want to be a mother who gave birth to poems. I do not want a stanza for a son, or a line for a little girl, or a footnote for a child who doesn't fit into this world. No, I do not want children who will live forever in the pages of poetry. It can't seem to outlive me. And this last piece I'll share, because I believe it's a mixed audience that we have. And I don't have a lot of poems that write to white folks or about white folks or considered the white gaze in that way. But this one I felt specifically compelled to write. And I feel compelled to share in this time as well. It's called Dear White People. It's based on and takes lines from a Facebook post where I asked Black people, if you could write a letter to white people, what would you say? Dear white people, don't even know where to start. In between my busy schedule comprised entirely of surviving white America, there's simply no time to write letters. Besides, any letter I write will most likely bring tears to your eyes, and I, for one, have had my fill of white tears. There are days I think you aren't worth my ink, that your whiteness is draining me of too much energy. It give you a taste of the tea for fear you'll colonize the whole kitchen. But today, I'm too angry to remain silent. Dear white people, stop making everything about you and how uncomfortable you are. I honestly don't give a flying fuck about your comfort level. You have made my very existence an exercise in discomfort. It's time for you to make room at the table. Better yet, go sit in the living room. I'm not here to coddle your feelings, not here for your amusement. No, you cannot touch my hair. This isn't a damn petting zoo. Stop coming into my office asking for the managers if you aren't already looking at one. Dear white people, stop telling me about this colorblind society you allegedly live in. Telling me you don't see race is the racist dribble I hope you choke on. Telling me you respect me but don't see my color is like saying you have to pretend I'm not Black in order to respect me. But let me assure you, I am Black, but there are plenty of things I'm not, like your sassy Black friend. Stop saying, hey girl, when you see me. You ain't that slick. I hear the way you talk to Becky and Steve every day. You sound like Vacation on Martha's Vineyard, where you spent summers wading in the bitter blue of the Atlantic. I wish my toes could touch the ocean without stepping on the bones of my ancestors. Dear white teachers, why don't I know who my ancestors are? Why is only one part of my history important enough to teach? And for the love of God, stop swiveling your heads every time slavery is mentioned. Newsflash, I wasn't there. And just because I'm the only Black person in this class doesn't mean you can ask me to speak on behalf of my race. I believe you care about the opinion of Black students when you stop shutting down conversations because I call a white student racist. Dear white people, why do you hate being called racist more than you hate racism? Why do you listen to Tim Wise over actual Black people about the Black experience? Dear white people, stop using Black on Black crime as a reason we shouldn't be outraged by the murder of Black people by white cops. If a Black person kills another Black person, they will go to jail. And that is what we call justice. If a white cop kills a Black person, they will get paid leave. And that is what we call justice. Apparently, justice is when a Black body dies. Dear white people, every time we've written white people, we've written it in lowercase because we are tired of you capitalizing on our pain. We are angry and raw and tired and angry and raw and tired and angry and raw and tired and tired and tired, but we will not rest because we know the future belongs to those who prepare for it. And you have been getting us ready for centuries. Thank you.
Hey, can you show that book again? And what the whole becoming Black? Okay, yeah. So please make sure people. I just want to make sure people can see it. I'm making sure that I can see it. I need everyone to see it so we can get that most definitely. And I think I was just talking to one of the panelists a little bit ago, just about how frustrating it is to have to be productive on days like this. Especially when not just thinking about the global shit that's happening, the national shit that's happening, and just the interpersonal what happens to our folks and our families and our loved ones during police violence, during anti-Blackness all the time. Just being Black already in a white supremacist society is fucking frustrating. And so I really feel you, especially on that piece of wishing our stuff wasn't relevant. Like after a few years, like after you wrote a piece so much about death and about all the injustice shit, you would like it to have just lived in that year. Like if it could just have lived in 2015 and that been it. And here we are, it's still fucking relevant. Yeah, and so I just so much appreciate your words and just you being willing to share with us, because I think that I think people often assume that because people get up and spit and share their work, that it somehow gets easier every time to share painful stuff, and it doesn't. It never does. And so I just want to thank you for your labor and your grace today, and just your directness. So thank you for all of that you gifted all of us with, and especially for other Black folks that are watching today and that need that.
All right, I appreciate again the invitation in space, and I look forward to everything else being offered today.
Thank you. Thank you, love. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so thank you. So again, and for those of y'all that were watching on the YouTube and the expo and all that stuff, you should be able to see the link for Frequency's payment options, because you can tip them. How great is it that in the year 2020 that you can also tip people digitally? How great, okay? So please make sure that you tip folks, and especially Black and brown folks, for their labor and their work, especially in times like this, in which we are putting out exponentially lots of labor during our day. Okay, and so it looks like, I think that all of our panelists are officially in. So what I'm gonna ask is our tech folks, as well as our panelists, for everybody's mics to be on, everybody's camera to be up, because I said something before introducing One Day / Frequency, was that there's a place in which I think bios are really important, because it situates us to who people are. I've had the blessing of putting together a panel of people that I love very dearly, that I care about very dearly, that are just badass organizers and activists and academics and all the different things today. And so I just know you're gonna be blown away by them. So I'm gonna talk about them a little bit, but they're fucking dope ass people. And you're gonna just in the same way that you got to be really invested in and get to really sit with a lot of necessary words and poetry from Frequency, I know that you are going to be transformed by the words and the thoughts and brilliance of Etsy, of Erica, and of Dane, right? And so for folks that have seen me present with Dane in the world, Dane says she having trouble turning on her camera. Dane, we gotta figure out your little camera, girl. We gotta figure out that camera. So that technology is gonna be worked out. Like, oh, I see something happening. I was like, girl, you cannot have your camera on, because we're not doing that.
You are so silly.
We're gonna get that together, okay? I was like, I don't care if I gotta fly down to DC right now. We're gonna get your camera on today, okay? But so for those that know or don't know, so Dane and I are co-editors and co-directors of Black Trans Prayer Book. So a book that will hopefully be a film coming in the next few years that we are kind of diligently working on. But of course, Dane is a brilliant, y'all heard me talk about her last night. Dane is a brilliant choreographer, poet, playwright, has written 13 books in the last 7 years, which makes me sick every time I hear it, because she's just good. She on her shit. So if you want to be around someone that's gonna make you more productive than you ever thought you ever could be, you need to be around Dane, because Dane just be like, I'd be like, what are you doing, Dane? She's like, oh, well, I just wrote a book this weekend. I was just sitting in my apartment, just meditating on the world, and it just came to me in the middle of the night. Like, just Dane is one of those people. It's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. Okay, so that's Dane. Of course, there's Etsy. So Etsy is this kind of organizer activist, and one of the biggest and I think most prolific political thought leaders, I think, of our time. And it's just someone that I'm always just so immensely taken aback by, I always learn something from, is someone that teaches me new ways of being autonomously, right? And not just that so many of us talk about existing outside of organizations, outside of this. Etsy is an autonomous organizer that has been just doing the work in so many different types of ways. Some ways I know what they're going to talk about, some I know that are the secrets of the world, like that are just for their stuff in the world. And so I'm not going to speak on all that stuff, but there's someone that I think is truly, and I know is truly saving lives, and is truly someone that is invested in Black and Brown liberation. And it's just someone that is amazing to watch, be around, and that I had the pleasure actually of meeting when I first moved out to the West Coast a few years ago. Etsy, like, even though they don't live in the magical land of Seattle where I live, was one of the first other Black trans folks that I got to meet when I moved out here. And so I've been so grateful ever since of just having them in my life and just knowing them in this work. Erica Hart, if you're not already familiar with the infamous sex educator, the infamous person who's also, I think, transforming the ways that for many spaces talk about Blackness, surviving cancer, and talking about sexual health as a Black body and as a non-binary person in the world. And so has been so prolific in creating spaces digitally and in person where people can really be with themselves in the expansiveness of what it means to have to be a sexual person as a Black body, experiencing all these different types of traumas and oppression simultaneously. And so I'm really excited for all the things that they're going to share today. Each and every single one of them is accessible on social media, so I do not want to bore you with all their accolades, because they got some bomb-ass accolades, so we're not going to go into all that, because I know, again, the words and the work that they have for us is going to be just that transformative for each and every single one of y'all watching, whether you are watching with us live or if you are blessed enough to get the replay. So for those of us that are going to get the replay too. And so again, if you have any questions, what's going to happen is the four of us are going to have a very semi-informal talk. Obviously I have questions, and so I have questions that I'm going to ask, like, y'all can answer them or not, but I'm hoping that you do, right? And then of course, if y'all have questions watching on the YouTube or the Expo, the tech folks will make sure that they get those questions to us. And so thank you so much for also to the tech people that have been making sure today runs smoothly. And I just want to circle back for a second before we get into our first question. But the book by Frequency, Becoming Black, is available at frequencyspeaks.com. So that's Frequency spelled FREQUENCYSPEAKS.com. So people can check out that book, frequencyspeaks.com. And I think that you should peruse their site, check out some of their videos, because again, they're doing some dope work in the world. Okay. Yeah, and so with that, y'all feel ready to get into a conversation?
Absolutely.
Y'all ready? Y'all ready? Yeah, and so the first question that I have for each and every single one of us on this space today, and you can jump in if there's a question that does not resonate with you. Of course, you don't have to answer it, but for questions that do, please feel free to jump in wherever it makes sense. But I would love to ask you all, how do you personally define liberation? Right, so how do you personally define liberation?
Well, I can say for myself, it's very, the definite, it probably is very basic, right? Which is the freedom from oppressive forces, the freedom from oppressive restrictions. I believe within liberation, there is found equity. There is found a deep understanding and investment in justice. And I say justice in its very, basic form, which is balancing the scales. And so, that I made a post one day and I said, when have Black people ever enjoyed liberty in the United States? And then I was like, I'll wait. Because we understand that's a not yet.
Yeah.
I won't say never, because never makes it seem like it's not possible. Never makes it seem like it can't be done, but I believe that it actually can be done, and I think that it's possible today.
Mhm.
That's it.
Thank you for that.
I think when I started thinking about this question, when you sent them, the same definition came to mind that Lady Dane said, which is the freedom from oppressive structures. And then I wanted to push that more, because what I really want is to have liberation without it even a definition attached to oppression. And I feel like you can't, it's hard for me to sit here and fathom or even imagine liberation without addressing oppression, or without re-traumatizing myself or other people and talking about what liberation could be. So I've been trying to read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler to get futuristic, to get, an invitation to what liberation could be that is created newly, separate from, what oppressive systems have made us want to imagine. But even Parable of the Sower is hard for me to sit and be with and read, and because I feel like I'm just in it. It is hard for me to imagine liberation when constantly I am at odds with oppression. So that this question is even hard for me to even imagine. I think as someone who does activist work and is in the world in that way, I think you would hope that I would have some hope for liberation, but at the same time, I just feel like it's exhausting to even consider. Yeah, I think that is literally the only way that I could answer that question, is that I wish that I could imagine it beyond oppressive structures, eliminating. I wish it wasn't even attached to it. I wish there was a new way to see liberation, and I don't have access to that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of that. I think a lot of our imaginaries are very inundated by, these oppressive structures and systems. I really do feel that liberation is definitely more, I think liberation is definitely more than centering ourselves, than centering humanity. It's like I want to focus on other forms of being that aren't so, just so steeped in westernization. And when I think about liberation, it makes me feel like, well, what is kind of moving us right now? What are the structures or ideas that are in place that are making us unconsensually do things? So it's also questioning coercive power, and I think I appreciated that you acknowledged in the efforts towards like autonomy that I put in, and when I say autonomy, I don't mean just as like an individual out here in these streets working alone. Like I have many comrades and many people who I've collaborated with and worked with, and I think that there's a difference between individual autonomy and collective autonomy, and asserting that would be liberation. Working with those things hand in hand, cooperatively, without the regulations and coercive colonial power structures, would be liberation. And government, it's like, what are the things that have historically been oppressing Black people? And like historically, governments are hella new to a lot of centralized kinds of ways of being is also hella new. An armed wing of the state is relatively new to people's experiences. So it feels like freedom freedom is coming, whether I just think like right now, the earth is kind of in this it's in the demand for like our autonomy, not just for ourselves, but like for earth herself, like I think all the restrictions and all the extractions and all of the commodifying of like land and resources, like I think we're going to come back. We're starting to come back to that kind of re-indigenization, and I think that's important especially for Black people. But yeah, that's all I have to say.
I appreciate all that. Just yeah, so this because when I was even listening to some of what all of y'all were saying, just this place of beyond westernization, beyond oppressive structures, I've been thinking a lot about and trying to hold, like, what does it even mean to have the right, like Erica, when you were talking about even dreaming, like having a hard time even imagining certain things. I think to me, liberation has been, at this point in my life, has been a lot about the right to dream and implement that, right? Like, in the freedom to dream and implement that is like, a lot of us are so bogged down by all these structures, or so bogged down by, not even a lot of us, we're all in the same mess, right? Like, we're all in this mess in so many different directions, in which it can be hard to think about what does the world look like after this, right? And so really, like, even I think that for some of us, depending on where we're at in our families or all stuff, like some of us have been having the ability to dream in ways that maybe some folks before us couldn't dream, or like some of us are able to dream in way maybe, or that's regressed in some of our families or structures, depending on where we kind of landed. And I've just been sitting in this place of, when people come after me, I'm hoping that young Black trans kids all over have the right to dream and do, right? And to have the capacity to dream and do, have the tools to dream and do, so most definitely.
I think that part of like, I love that we're having this conversation about imagining, right? And the idea of dreaming. I think that that's what white supremacy attempts to do. And that is a part of its oppressiveness and its oppressive forces, right? Is that it doesn't want us to ever be able to have space or room to envision anything beyond the structure of what it is, because white supremacy it loves nothing beyond itself.
Yes.
And it makes nothing but destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And so it hates life and it hates rebirth, right? And all of its machinations and all of its agents and perpetuators, one of their sole jobs is to not only enslave bodies, enslave whole families, and enslave whole generations, but in some kind of way keep the mind from being able to imagine new possibilities. And so that's why I think, like, so many of our activists are also artists. So many of our visionaries are also artists, because at the heart of the artist is this ability to be able to tap into something beyond the now, right? And that it gives us the artist is truly an envisioner.
That's also why I think the arts are so underfunded, because they are a thing that kind of keep the reality of like beyond the moment alive, right? They're a thing that allow us to be rooted in a possible future in which we exist, in which we have our rights, in which we have all this capacity, and even just like looking at all of us here, right? So like thinking about you, Dane, as this writer, like Etsy, I can't help but see you got some of your artwork behind you, back there, like visual artist, right? Like, not that I'd be peeping your stuff, but I'm looking behind you. Erica, knowing that you connected through so many people, even just with photography, like a single image shot around the world, right? And kind of change people's capacity in some kinds of ways, right? That art is so necessary and transformative in a way beyond the popular media narratives that we get, right? That we have a right to design ourselves. And a lot of times people try to, I hear so many people try to dictate who gets to be an artist, who gets to be a serious artist, or who not. It's like art for Black and brown people, it has to happen. It is, right? It comes, it's something that we remind ourselves that we exist even in all this stuff, right? So that's just also, I'm really kind of curious to even see for y'all, for yourselves, that I think art has played such a big role in the ways that I know that I've connected to you all through movements. I'm curious to see, like, when you think of yourselves in this larger movement around liberation, what do you feel your role is, right?
I think the role that I feel like I've kind of taken up is regardless of popularity, or regardless of being liked, or regardless of being seen as no criminal, too wild. These are just all really, to me, just great things, great title. Like, it's just, when I think about like just owning up to the kinds of like threats that some of these peoples have like made us out to be. It's like, I just feel like there's just too much respectability, and I just think in the last few years I felt really isolated in my ideas, and I've been told by other popular comrades like that, yeah, like honestly, like people don't really like revolutionaries. I've never self-titled myself as a revolutionary, because that's not up to me to decide. I think there's revolutionary principles and ideas. I also think revolution is, it depends on the context and ideology. So yeah, I think it's really isolating. There's like a kind of, I was talking about like what is Black anarchism, the other day, like, when there were slave revolts and they didn't have like a book to be Maoist. They didn't have a book to be Marxist. They didn't have that book to like free themselves in that way. Like, how did they get free? They made the steps that they needed to do free themselves from ownership of their masters. And if that meant ending them, then that's what that meant. And it's like, if there isn't any blueprint, and there isn't like a particular design for them to even follow or trust, they were doing that themselves. That is Black anarchism. So like, in a coordinated way, in a coordinated effort, having this planning, having autonomy, having, intramurally having self-determination. I just feel like, yeah, I want to own up to that kind of like that spacing. And I think that the state is really good at imposing that kind of like Negrophobia and Narcophobia, of the fear of that, what people can dream for themselves by themselves, like collectively, without a state apparatus, without a specific like leader. It's like, you think people who were just freed want someone to like lead, be the leader, to take on that master positionality? Like, no. So I just think that like back to the point of my role of like owning up to what my ancestors did, and like honoring that part, but honoring the other sides too, of like, there's a lot of like I love Saidiya Hartman's writing, and like how she writes about like honoring like, so like, what an amazing like effort to honor sex workers and young Black women who were just like out here having to live, but like in wild ass ways. And I feel like, like I want to be one of those people. I am one of those people. And I think with different different mediums, like whether it be visionary, like arts or music, poetry, performance art, like I think, and accompanying like the liminal space that I do, being, you know, between genders, being between races, I think it's like, I kind of feel like it's my duty to bring up like certain aspects of other ideas and insights. Like it's like that's what trans and two-spirit and non-binary and uh, we've done before colonization. So that's what I just think my role is. So like, you know, yeah.
I think to echo many of those statements, to be constantly reminded that white supremacy loves a leader. It loves a CEO, it loves a president, it loves a governor, it loves a state representative, an executive director. It loves all of those leadership, but Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and they all look very similar. They all look either white, cisgender, able-bodied, and just respectable. I mean, Malcolm X is oftentimes lauded as not respectable, but if anybody actually read the autobiography of Malcolm X is actually pretty respectable and pretty misogynistic, which goes along the lines of what people lift up inside of white supremacy as a leader. So what I'm constantly being reminding myself in a world as I navigate white supremacy that loves a leader is I really want people to forget my name. Like, I don't want you to be attached to who I am, but be left with what the difference that I made. You know, if you're left with reparations for Black people, then I did my job. If Black people get reparations from the state, then I did my job. If the police state is abolished, then I did my job. I don't need to be in a book about Black leaders. I don't need to be on a list that any magazine does. I don't need any of that shit. I just want the difference to be made. And I want to be a disruption. You know, people shared my photo over and over and over again inside of trauma porn around breast cancer. And I had to remind them that, like, wait a minute, this is not what this is gonna be. And I feel like I've always been that person when it was like, well, okay, let's talk about, I don't know, let's talk about Black history. There's always a conversation. Let's go further. Let's dig deeper here. There's more here to talk about. There's more here to do, even the sex ed work that I do. Very, very white fields. There's always a conversation of how we can go deeper. I feel like I'm always that person. And I want other people to be a part of that. If I'm not in the space, I don't want it to not have it. I don't want it to be that if I'm not in the space, then non-binary people are not brought up inside of breast cancer spaces. If I'm not in the space, I don't want it to be that we're not talking about sex work when we're talking about sex ed. Like, I want my role in this movement to that the impact to be there. I don't care that if I'm known. That's something I really am working personally to move away from, and also just want other people to be left with.
You know, in reflection of that, it's so funny because my sister Erica Totten and Rochelle Faithful, who is a part of the Black Trans Prayer Book, they did some restorative justice work with a group that I am a part of, and they talked about a leaderful movement. Meaning understanding that we're really all leaders, right? Like we all are contributing in very many ways, something that is essential. I think that the movement is like a web, right? Each strand of the web is necessary in order for it to become what it is. And so, you know, shout out to Grandmother Spider. And so in the space. Yeah, I think about, you know, what are the things that are left? And I love, Erica, that you brought up about they love a leader, because they don't just love a leader, they also love to kill the leader.
That's right.
That's right. So that they can try to kill the movement, right? Like, there's a reason why they killed so many of these people who are lauded as leaders in Black movements, it is because they really, you know, white supremacy says there can only be one. And I think that, like, if we are talking about liberation, if we're talking about our futures, our future has to, our ideologies have to dismantle internally, externally, and go beyond these white supremacist ideas of what makes a leader.
When I'm listening to all of y'all, so some of the things like, Etsy, one of the first things which you were saying around how people in different spaces hate revolutionaries, or they hate that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about the ways that we get de-radicalized through trying to, you know, whether it's through the ways that people are trying to be on, whether it's through nonprofit spaces, I think de-radicalize us in so many different ways and try to get us to buy more into the government system versus doing the work that we actually know needs to get done. Whether it's us like all participating in the ways that we do on social media, things like that, and getting kind of like brought up into that celebrity culture, all that kind of stuff. And so this place around where we constantly hear, and I just heard this yesterday, someone said, you know, where is our Malcolm, or where is our Harriet, or where is, you know, right? Like all we're saying, they're dead. They're literally dead, right? Most of those people were murdered, okay? They didn't die peacefully. They didn't die in the ways that they should have. They were murdered, right? So many of those people were murdered, right? And so to think about when I even witness people saying that, I'm often witnessing them saying that in front of other people that are doing lots of the good work, right? That are doing the work that needs to be done. So I'm witnessing people that actually don't think that work, that Leader Full movement, that Beyond Celebrity movement is valuable. Right? They're looking people in the face and telling them that what they're doing isn't useful or isn't good enough or isn't thought out enough because they don't agree with it or because it's a tactic that they personally would not do. Right? And so they're looking for these leaders that, had they been alive right now, they still wouldn't have respected. Even as respectable as those people were, like when we talk about Malcolm and MLK, even as respectable as those people were, if they were alive today, those same people would still not even be following them. Right? So there's this mythology that even in our communities that there would somehow be this very radical leader that does all the right things, that we would also all deeply be invested in, even if we haven't worked on our own anti-Blackness, right? And so I also want us to think about for ourselves, and just not for us on this, and when I'm saying us, like not us like on this call, but just like us, like the collective us, as Black folks, as brown folks, as Indigenous folks, thinking about the ways that we consistently buy into that de-radicalization, right? And that consistently we throw other organizers, throw other leaders, throw other people that are doing the work that needs to be done, that are, you know, disrupting spaces, that are doing things that, you know, that the people that are, whether it's, you know, making the food for us, and like people that are doing the farmland work, whether it's people that are creating housing structures for us, whether it's people I was mentioning a group last night, like No Justice, No Pride, that I think about a lot, who are, you know, who are housing and feeding people off of sex work, and are open and honest about that, because that's the fuck what needed to happen. It needs to happen for people on the ground, right? And how much that those same folks are cut out of grant structures and cut out of systems that would adequately sustain them, you know? So I want us to really be honest with ourselves about how do we also participate in denigrating the people who are leaders of today, right? And who are actually building the movements that we need to see. You know? And so that brings me to our next piece. So in this moment right now, we're kind of living in a clusterfuck, right? So many things, right? It's kind of hard to even figure out what's happening, right? Because there's some things that have been constants for us, right? So we consistently experience anti-Blackness. We consistently experience attacks on Indigenous folks in Indigenous spaces. We consistently experience attacks on trans and non-binary folks, on women, on working class folks, and all these different things. And now we have this added piece around COVID and quarantine, right? Where some of us can quarantine, some of us can't. Some of us need to quarantine, some of us still aren't able to, right? And so when we're looking at that, we're looking at the state violence against us, we're looking at the vigilante violence against Black and brown bodies. I'm kind of wondering for y'all, because to me, the biggest thing that's coming up around that is the ways that Black and brown people are denied bodily autonomy. Right? So that's the biggest thing, is that to me, like in all these spaces and all these realities, we are consistently denied bodily autonomy, right? And so I'm wondering, what does bodily autonomy mean for Black and Brown folks specifically mean for you all? And what would it look like for Black and Brown folks to have bodily autonomy realized? Does that make sense for y'all?
Mhm.
Can you say it again one time for me? Can you say it one more time for me?
You know, because I was born in New Jersey. Sometimes I'll be speaking fast. I was
You be
born on the
rolling.
East Coast. Right? So I mean, you know, I'll be keeping up. Okay, so question was, what does bodily autonomy for Black and Brown folks look like for y'all or mean to you all? And what would bodily autonomy for Black and Brown folks look like fully realized? Because I don't think that we can have it fully realized right now, or it is fully realized right now for most of us, at least based off of the current system that we're in, right? So just specifically, what does bodily autonomy look like for Black and Brown folks?
I feel like bodily autonomy for Black folks looks like not being misgendered in life and also in death. Not being able to exist inside of our transness without contest. And I find that that is an issue of bodily autonomy, because I find that people have lumped being trans inside of some white identity and being non-binary inside of some white identity. And then when a Black person is identifying as trans or non-binary, that somehow is an assault to their Blackness. And I find that if we could just have bodily autonomy, we could just be all the things. And it would be just, it is a celebration of our Blackness, and it would be seen as that. Bodily autonomy looks like not having the adultification of Black femmes and treating them like they're adults. Not touching Black people, their hair, their body. I think also in the ways that we talk about Black people and Black queer people in a way that we're only, a lot of times the narratives around Black queer people and Black trans people are just that it's just trauma. There's no celebration of our relationships or our friendships or our chosen families. And I feel like bodily autonomy looks like talking about all the ways we experience life, not just the ways that we come in contact with death. Yeah, and I think too, like a big part of bodily autonomy is having the capacity for and access to pleasure in a way that feels good for yourself, and not put in the hands of someone else. And that is like, that's a thing for everybody, but especially Black people. It's like, I am so used to not being able to say what I want or being shut down when I say what I want, that now if I assert what I need inside of pleasure, I'm doing too much. And bodily autonomy for me is just that freedom to just exist inside of our bodies and whatever we may need. And it may not look like, it may look like being on the A spectrum and asserting that that is where you stand and really being firm in that. That's what bodily autonomy looks like for me.
Since y'all so formulate, I'm going to jump in on this real quick. Because no, that piece, like actually when you started speaking, I was thinking, yeah, I was jumping into the pleasure piece, right? So just the idea of, especially around this could seem like a small thing for some people, but it's not a small thing. It's a conversation I keep having with people. So I know it's important, and I don't really have the language to really flesh it out in some ways, but I think so much about what does it mean to be Black trans person and dating or having sex or being around people that often don't take your body seriously or your right to love seriously or being treated with kindness seriously. And so there's even the autonomy of saying that we as Black trans people have a right to healthy relationships, right? And loving relationships. And if we should want to be sexual or desire to be sexual, not just with people, I think we should be grateful for the experience, but people that also love and pour into us and care about us and treat us with gentleness and care, right? In all those kinds of ways, I think that pleasure is often denied from Black trans folks and non-binary folks, and also it gets minimized, right? As if it's as if connecting with people romantically and or sexually is not a part of human existence, or a part of ways that we build connection, or part of ways that we even build alliances with others, right? And so I think that some of that, the politicalness of how we treat our romantic and dating partners, to me, is sometimes missing in our autonomy.
Yes.
I think I 100% agree with that. I believe bodily autonomy should include the abolition of the state. And what I mean by that are not just all of the apparatuses that the state encompasses, like the police and the courts and just the kind of armed forces, the government that we're often very much coerced and don't consent to have these like relationships with, but also all of the state's kinds of ideas. When I think about what the state has crafted and socialized us into are like frameworks of anti-Blackness and frameworks of transphobia, frameworks of like we were talking about, of setting and regulating our own imaginations to the point where like, yeah, people who are socialized by these state institutions, these colonial white settler institutions, are then socialized to then hate everything that initially was incepted by it. So that is like, it is a world of anti-Blackness that we're living in. And like, what would it mean to be free from that, to be free from those kinds of socialization or thinking? I just feel like there's like a kind of, I guess there isn't, I think when we think about our bodies, we detach it from one another. Like we obviously, like we have our own self-interest. We have like, no one can really represent me. And I really want to challenge just the logics of that kind of representation when it comes to like bodily, like autonomy and things like that. Like our worlds have ended, like colonization has literally ended millions of Black people's lives, millions of Indigenous people's lives, millions of Indigenous Black people's lives. But not only our lives, but like the world that we live in, and world meaning like what we had amongst each other. And I think we're kind of seeing the unhinging of the kind of world that the state and like colonization have imposed on everyone and everything. And I think it's the powers that be are threatened, and it feels really coordinated. It's hard to not think about the current context of like what we're going through without thinking like, that this violence, this kinds of cop killings of Black bodies, Black people, aren't coordinated, because there's been so many in the last like week. And I just want to know like what's the acceleration? Why is that accelerating? Is it because we're expressing our autonomy? Is it because we're being those threats? We're becoming, way more threatening. And it is, these ideas are, and you can't really imprison that. So I think, that's what I think of when I stew on bodily autonomy.
I think one of the things that's coming up for me just watching, so talking about that coordination piece, right? One thing that's actually been very heartbreaking for me to watch over the last few weeks is so we have this iteration in which we've had two major explosions of protests in the last few weeks, right? So we have protests that are happening right now, and we have protests that happened last month. And so in watching the protests that happened last month, especially around white folks who were like, oh, we should not be quarantined here. We have a right to get back to our jobs. And I heard a lot of people talking about, oh, well, it's just like white Republicans doing this thing. It's white XYZ people doing this thing. And I was like, actually, I know a lot of Black people, and I'm watching lots of Black and brown people that are also saying that we need to get back to our jobs. And so in that place of bodily autonomy, I'm witnessing people in our own communities that don't think that they have a right to be cared for outside of producing, right? Or that don't believe that they have a right to have their housing taken care of, their food taken care of, their bodies taken care of without having to show up at a job that doesn't appreciate them and is consistently undervaluing and underpaying them. And so the place I'm at is sort of how do we even, and this could be just like, this is a larger piece, but even that back to that imagination piece, like how do we even get to a place in which people truly internalize that who they are and their worth and their like actually substantially matters, right? It actually substantially materially matters and should not be based off of what you do for capitalism today, right? Because I actually didn't know how many people that I was connected to that felt that way until those protests last month happened.
Well, I mean, the easiest way to do that would be to abolish the state. Right. Just to reflect on what Nancy said. Abolish white supremacy, abolish anti-Blackness. I mean, like that is really the easiest way. It's so funny that you said that, because as I was like thinking about like, what my answer would be about this question about autonomy, I was like, when I think about my own body, and I think about my own life's autonomy, right? I think about, I asked myself the question, who are you beyond this like feeling of having to produce for the state, or for capital, or for X, Y, and Z? And I think that for so many folks, because white supremacy attempts to deaden the imagination, it is hard, right? It is hard to think about the fact that so many of our elders, right, like have worked all their lives and they die in poverty. Even though they were promised, if you work hard, you should be able to at least rest when you get old, right? When you become an elder. And so how do I imagine my own autonomy and my own body and my own life for myself is that I say to myself, you existing today is enough. And if that is the only thing that I have done today was woke up this morning and existed, then I have done my sacred duty.
Come on.
To myself and to my ancestors.
Speak on it, sis. I just also want to add that I just feel like bodily autonomy is also not having to sell your labor in order to live, not having to, perpetuate like this kinds of ritualizing the valuation and hierarchies and logics of like these dead white slave owners on pieces of paper. And like what that does to our psyches, like we're literally using dead white slave owners to establish, what every civil society as it is, which civil society clearly hasn't given a fuck about us since, colonization was incepted in this land, which was, taken from indigenous peoples. So like, yeah, it's time to pop off. It's Black and indigenous solidarity and POC revolts. Like, I just feel like there's nothing that you can tell me in regard to oppression that the state isn't behind.
Mhm.
Whether it's prisons, whether it's the police, whether it's the courts that schedule and regulate the logics and propriety of how to move and like resist even, it's
Mhm.
like, it's hands down, it's rooted in that. And when we talk about radical, like what is radical, what is rooted in our oppression and liberation, I just think that yeah, it's always seems to be the state is behind it.
Mhm.
So what is representation, or what is our trying to opt into the positions that the state doles out? Like, what does that actually perpetuate? It's like an abuser. It's like
Yeah.
is like Black people's first ever like abusive relationship, abusive, pathological, narcissist relationship that we're having. And it's like, no, you need to like, here, get some right. Here's your rights. You can vote now. We're considering you to be a human. You're not there yet. The Constitution that says you're 3/5 of a person still exists, but we're on it. We're working on it. Just hold on. Like, you'll get it. You'll get your freedom. Keep going at it. But master narrative.
Mhm.
It's just master narrative. That's all it is. And I'm tired, and I'm I'm just like, I'm done with trying to opt into coercive power systems, like whether it be Marx, who's also imposing, like, it's like, I don't want to be your worker horse. I shouldn't have to opt into some other global political economy that like hasn't historically represented me anyway when we were a commodity. Like, I don't want to have to opt into those logics and force other already existing indigenous people who haven't been in contact with those kinds of ideas, force them to then detach from their lands in the same industrializing ways. No, like, I'm done.
Yeah. Then I think no, that's like, it's perfect. Just use we should be mad. We should be angry. We should be breaking shit. Okay, we should be angry. But so going back to even like what Dane was talking, Dane, what you were saying around, as we get older and like being able to be taken care of, like when Etsy, when I hear you talking about even just like this first abusive relationship that we have, right? Like with the state, like consistently as Black folks, even that word civil, right? That civility, like civility has never included Black and brown people. Like the creation of civility was the creation of white power structures, period, right? Like on this land, and with and removing and desecrating Black and brown bodies, period. Civility is not about us, right? And so I'm thinking in that framework of like, because we're so often so tired. So even like in our 20s and 30s and 40s, like we're already burnt out. We're already burnt out on so many different levels. And so to me also that autonomy is about being able to rest now too. Like we should have a right to rest. We should have a right. We have actually been working hard against something that's been trying to kill us for many years. And so even at this place, there shouldn't be a certain timestamp on it. It's like we should always be able to say like, actually at this point, I am tired right now. I do have a right to be taken care of. I do have a right to opt out or to move away from this thing, you know?
I think rest is also an act. I think sometimes when we think about pleasure, right, we often just only think about it as we only think about it oftentimes within sexual terms, within a sexual, but I'm writing this book called She of the Fallen Stars, and it takes place in the year 4000, and there's this spiritual group called the Church of Pleasure, right, the Universal Church of Pleasure. And so when I think about pleasure, I think about also like eating something that I enjoy, and not like berating myself for enjoying eating that thing. I think about rest, like really like real rest. It's very pleasurable to me. Being able to lay in bed and be like, you know what, I'm good today, y'all. So like I think that like even the ways in which some folks talk about, and when I say some folks, I mean like people who are invested in white supremacy, talk about, talk about, right, like what even is our pleasure for people who are invested in a white supremacist society or even ideologies. It is that even our pleasure is a tool of the state. And
Yeah.
so I choose to redefine, reaffirm what my pleasures are, and also actively engage them.
Yes.
Most definitely, most definitely. Because I was, so also just, and this is a lesser extent to that. Like, just even as I'm thinking about, so many of us being stuck inside, and all the different marketing tactics that are, trying to get us to buy into things that we maybe we wouldn't even know that we wanted or desired or anything like that, and just how that is being used against us right now, being stuck in a place and we're getting to be turned into even more consumers or more,
Yes.
based off of what those desires are. I want to acknowledge that it's right about, it's like, so for me on the magical West Coast, it's about 1:12 p.m. I know on the magical East Coast for Erica and Dane, it is about 4:12. Nancy, it is the correct time of 1:12. And so I'm like, listen. But so I have about 3 more questions I want to ask. So we might get to all of them. We might not get to all of them, because I want to also make space for, I know that there's people watching us on the YouTube stuff. So for the tech folks that are coordinating us right now, I want to, y'all can post whatever questions people might have on the YouTube for us here in the Zoom chat. We're ready for those questions whenever. Because we're kind of going back again to this idea of pleasure, and things like that. I want to kind of jump into this question around sex and sexuality. So I know we said pleasure is beyond sex and sexuality pieces, but I think also all 3 of y'all do some very important work around sex and sexuality, whether it's talking about childhood sexual assault, whether it's talking about sexual education, whether it's talking about sacred sexuality and sacred sex work. You all come from such varied vantage points and practices about how you claim, proclaim, and talk about sex and sexuality, I think in public spaces that is so fucking important. And so in this time of COVID-19 and quarantine, I want to kind of ask y'all and shift a little bit to what comes up for you all as you navigate sexual health, sexual relationships, and even trauma or sexual autonomy during this time. I know for me, especially on the trauma piece, that, being on quarantine or being in a place where we don't necessarily, even if we ourselves are not on quarantine, but that our friends and family and people that are away from are on quarantine or experiencing all these things, that it can kind of mess with your head in lots of different types of ways, to the point that we're reliving trauma or kind of sitting with our thoughts in new kinds of ways. And so I'd really love to know how do y'all navigate sex and sexuality, sexual trauma, and sexual relationships or sexual relationships during this time of COVID-19 and quarantine?
I find myself really having to check my own expectations of sex, or not my expectations, but my kind of like the expectations that have been imposed on me via white supremacy, that says, because me and my partner are home, we should be fucking all over the place like rabbits. Like, that is something that should be happening. We should be doing that. I should be aroused. He should be interested in wanting to be with me. And then I have to come back and be like, okay, wait a minute. These are all inherited thoughts. None of this is real, especially during a pandemic. Like, our emotions are all over the place as we go through a pandemic that I don't know if I think I was alive for the last pandemic we had, but I wasn't really present to it as a kid. Like, I didn't really know what was happening, but as an adult, like, I'm very clear what's going on, I'm not even clear what's going on, to be completely frank with you. So without understanding what could potentially happen to my body and what's happening to other people's bodies, and how, the state again is failing to protect people, being engaged in any sort of sexual activity is not necessarily where I want to be right now. And then sometimes I have to, as an act of pleasure and as a way of like, okay, I need a moment to myself. Can you go take a walk? To actually masturbate, because even masturbation isn't something that is on my brain. It's not something that I want to do. I think the first week of social distancing, I was watching the news every single day. I don't even watch the news. So that was new. And the pain of watching the news on a regular basis was impacting me so much that I had to, I guess, as a function of my health and also my sexual health, was to stop watching the fucking news. And now there is intentional actions that I have to do around checking my inherited thoughts, taking time to masturbate. And as you were speaking about, J. Mace, also being mindful and going to therapy and checking in about the sexual trauma that I've experienced. Because in this time of sitting still, all of those emotions come up, those memories kind of flash back, sometimes even without me wanting to push it down. And I feel like without a distraction of hanging out with my friends or traveling for work, that it just leaves room for all of these thoughts to come up. And I don't know that I've figured out a way to really manage any of it, but but I have thought that, you know, otherwise it would just be buried. So I think it's important for me to be addressing whatever is coming up for me around sex and sexuality, these expectations that are inherited, things that I don't, that I'm just like, we should be doing this thing. Anytime I'm like, we should be, or we could be, then I know that it has nothing to do with what actually could be happening, which is sitting in front of the television and watching reality TV.
Dane, you on mute, love.
Sorry.
I see you trying to contribute, but you on mute. Okay.
Yeah, I think about you know, I am very grateful to be able to be in space and to be around my partner at this time, right? Where I think that isolation can be very difficult. And so while I'm not able to be around a lot of folks like normal, I am able to be around my partner. And so hey, sex. And also but then also, right, masturbating when I need to, doing all of these things, and not feeling like I have to be on a schedule, because like, when you're so busy, sometimes you be like, okay, we need to schedule all of these things.
That's right.
And I need for you to pencil me in on Friday. And then so I'm allowing for my sexual self to be able to be listened to when she is manifesting. And also, being in clear communication and in dialogue with my partner about where they are during this pandemic, where they are sexually, where they are emotionally, right? Like during this time. And then also, like, your question, I saw your question, Mace, when you sent it to us in the email, and it was a little bit difficult for me because, like, when we're talking about sexual trauma and what's happening during this time, during the pandemic, because we're not supposed to be around our elders in this moment without a lot of safety precautions. Being able to like actually be in space with my elders like normal isn't possible. And so I've had to, during this time, like for people who are close to me, and not everyone knows this, but I've had to, in order to to have access to those elders, I've had to engage with an abuser. And that has been very difficult for me because, I'm used to, telling my partner, okay, this weekend we're going to go see X, Y, and Z. And having and being able to actually have my own direct connection. But because of the pandemic, because of the ways things are working out, if a cell phone isn't working, if a thing isn't happening, I'm having to now be in communication with an abuser in order to get a hold of some people, and that has been difficult. How am I processing that in this moment is that I call people like Mace. And I also don't feel ashamed about feeling sad about having to engage an abuser, or feeling uneasy about that, or just doing the thing that I feel like so many of us have to do, which is like, well, you just got to do it because that's what you got to do in order to do what you got to do. Right. Which so many of us have been told in our families for however long, that engaging abusers is something that we should normalize. And so I am also in this moment allowing myself to be vulnerable with some folks who I'm vulnerable with anyway, but in a way that allows for me to be like, I had to call this person in order to like talk to X, Y, and Z today. And now I'm like crying, or now I'm really angry, and I just need to like chat with you about it, or just sit in silence with someone, right? Even if it's on a Zoom or a phone call. That was my long way of saying all of those things.
That wasn't long at all. Especially in context, like I think that, I think some of us, because that place of, what we're supposed to be doing, or how we're supposed to be reacting, or what we're supposed to be doing to get through certain things, the reality is like, we're all going through a collective trauma. Like, I don't care who you are, where you are, what have you. It's traumatic to know that there is a pandemic going on, regardless of, and we're all at different levels, right? So I know, and Dane, like I've had few family members impacted by different medical things during all this stuff, and like just all the different things that are all the different moving pieces. And so sometimes, even if people don't necessarily share the same type of trauma before this moment, right? We might all find ourselves crying at random moments. We might find ourselves like being angry at moments. We might find ourselves doing things that don't make sense because some of us haven't really reconciled that we are having traumatic stress responses to something that it's normal to have that response to, right? So even just thinking about allowing ourselves to be honest about our emotions being more erratic than they would typically be, or being more all over the place, or being triggered a lot easier because we're already on that high alert, right? In addition to what you're sharing, which is like not just being on high alert, but now also having to engage a whole nother person, right? And being in these spaces that are going to put you on a different type of edge. I think for myself, I'm thinking a lot about just even the idea of being locked in an apartment all day, and like how that kind of reactivates some things. And I'm like, oh wow, I thought I healed from that already. Oh, I thought me and my therapist, we did the thing for these years, and I thought that was done. And you're like, oh wow, I guess here it is again. And just being able to be honest with myself, like, okay, yeah, I could have, like, healing is not, like that place when people are like, oh, it's not linear, and you listen to them and you really didn't believe it, and you're like, yeah, well, that's for you it's circular, for you it's this, not for me, I've been doing the work, and you can kind of revisit that with yourself and just kind of so even for myself, just thinking about ways that I spend more time meditating than I would before, like breathing and spending some more intentional prayer time, or spending more time at my altar than I think I would, or spending more time just allowing myself to break down when I need to, and being okay with that just might be what happens, most definitely.
I definitely feel like my my gender expression has a lot to do with my like sexuality or lack of it, or like and or acceleration of it. I guess yeah, what you're saying about experiencing pandemic as like a trauma, and then also being inundated with like the visuals of seeing, you know, Black people getting murdered and trans Black women getting murdered and cis Black women getting murdered and Black men getting Black men, Black cis men, Black trans men. Like it's just like a lot. And I think I think for me, like, yeah, I think the reason why a lot of us like really put a lot of our hopes and dreams and ideas into our work and artistry, whether it be the writing or the visual or the even the on the ground, you know, like I've seen like people, it's art, you know, people are moving the world with like their ideas, and that is also like I want to acknowledge that as a kind of artistic endeavor in shaping and designing the world and what we want to see. But I feel like for me, because of all of those pre-existing kinds of like traumas, I and upbringing, you know, again back to being socialized within like white supremacist and like Eurocentric and Christianized thinking, and feeling really much like I am not allowed to be sexual, especially when it's, you know, when it's, I just internalize that kind of like femphobia, queerphobia for such a long time, that I did. I think I did really honestly identify as asexual. I wasn't comfortable in my body. I wrote some pieces on it, and was like, you know, identified as that openly until I started hormonally transitioning, and then I was like, oh, what's this feeling? Oh, he's cute. Oh, and you know, feeling comfortable enough to like be touched. And like I'm a really late bloomer. Like I'm late to the trade. Like I'm late to like a lot of the catching up, you know, within the last like 5 years of being sexual. I feel like I'm able to turn it off. Like it's like I gag at like how some people that I know are in multiple polyamorous relationships, and it's like I don't know if it's the boredom of like the person that they're living with, or the need to like but like it's like you really have to go like threaten your own life to for a hookup. Like right now, like you can't, because there was like a whole span of time where like, yeah, you might not have had the hormones to then like the urges, but I reflect back on to those times of like when I wasn't sexual, and like I'm like I can do that. I can do that for my life because if it means like hooking up with like a person, you know, I'm not in a relationship. I'm not in like a lot of Black trans people aren't necessarily in like, you know, sexual or romantic relationships. So I feel like there's probably, yeah, it's like sometimes it feels like, oh, that's weird that I'm like almost like kind of numbing those urges, or like I don't have access to somebody to, you know, to touch, and like people are talking about, oh, you need those like moments of hugs and like human contact, and that's necessary for their psyche. And I'm like, damn, then like what is prison? You know, what are the people who are in solitary confinement, like dealing with and like really challenging the notion that like we're on a lockdown. It's not a lockdown. Like we have to not we have to still like physically distance from each other to stop the spread of COVID. And like that is definitely what worries me in the uprisings that we're seeing. You know, people are forgetting, and people are getting arrested and being put into prisons or jails where the likeliness of COVID is to spread, is to cultivate. So it seems like, you know, like seeing some of these videos of like, you know, it's angers people, and you want to go out, but it also feels like some weird trap. Like it also feels like, oh damn, like are they just like wanting mass people to get arrested so they can just die in prison, you know, or get COVID? And you know, I don't want to get into all the conspiracy theories, but basically I don't really I ain't be seeing anybody like or feeling up on it, you know, like I think yeah, like I you know, live with that, like in finding the time to like pleasure myself, or it's just like Erica said, it's like I have to literally schedule it, because like all of the things have like really affected my drive. And I think it's good, you know, I have fantasies about, you know, it's like I was asexual before, pre-transition, now I'm home. And like I feel like that's, you know, it's important aspect of myself to acknowledge that like you can be in one place and then go into another and then possibly go back to that place.
Thank you for that.
I was
Yeah.
like, was my mic off the whole time? I was like, I'm also not wearing my glasses, so like I like need to. I should make sure.
I love you so much. I think so many different directions. Yeah. So I actually have a quick question. I have a quick question for Erica that was asked on the YouTube situation. Then I have another question I want to ask for folks. But so Erica, you were talking about. I'm saying trying to touch my screen as if that was going to do something. It's not. Well, so sometimes like I got this like dual tap thing. It's supposed to. I didn't just make it up. But so Erica, you have been talking about the should be's and could haves when you're talking about social should be's.
Yeah.
So this person asked, how do you get beyond those should be's and could haves?
When they come up, I just think, okay, you are inside of some expectation that doesn't belong to you, something that has been placed onto you. And you don't need to be doing anything. Like I know people in my life right now have a should. Black people have a should about going to protest. They have a should about writing a post. They have a should about educating white people. And none of that is something that they have to be doing. Existing, as Lady Dane said, as a Black person is a protest. Like none of that is necessary. But when we're shoulding ourselves, I would go as far to say that to should yourself into doing something other than what feels good for you right now is a function of white supremacy, is a tool of white supremacy. So if you have a should or you have a could and you are a marginalized body, especially a Black, queer, trans person, just let it go. Like, just, okay, I got you, should, heard, and I will continue watching this Married at First Sight or Housewives of Atlanta.
Hey.
And I think that's so important. And so I wanted to reiterate the part where you said, especially for marginalized and Black and queer and trans people, right? So like, there's some people, there's some shit they do got to get.
That's exactly. When I say there's some white people, there are white people and they don't listen to them. They don't listen to the shoulds. They don't listen. They don't listen to the I should have said excuse me. They don't listen to the I should have moved out of the way. I should have not taken up space in that classroom. White people listen to your shoulds. Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, you don't really got to listen to your shoulds. But the next panel is about non-Black people of color because we got to talk about that too. But I'll just be quiet.
But that's not. But again, that's not this panel. Okay. So right. So like, all those things. Yeah, Etsy, were you about to say something? You were just jumping on. Okay, you're like, no, I'm strictly just putting on my glasses. I'm just being very like, sorry right now. So I wanted to read this comment that was left on the YouTube on my share. So just in response to what people were saying. So, oh my goodness, y'all can't see the Zoom comment, so I'm not going to say that out loud to everyone on the YouTube. Anyway, there's still, from Amy, there's so much stigma within the survivor community in regards to sexual relationships. It's as if we're supposed to permanently be disconnected from our bodies, which is utter BS. And yeah, so the reality is lots of us on this call right now, right? So I think at least most of us, if not all of us, have experienced some sort of sexual trauma, right, or other stuff, right? And the reality is like, for those of us that identify as sexual beings, like we have a right to still be sexual, we have a right to touch, we have a right to pleasure, we have a right to healthy relationships and sexual experiences, right? So I'm tired of talking to other Black, trans, and non-binary people about the plethora of unhealthy sexual and relationship experiences that we get dealt, right? From all kinds of spaces, even people that purport to be parts of our communities, right? That still don't see the value of Black, trans, and non-binary bodies and lives and love, right? Like all those things. Yeah, so thank y'all for that. So I have another question. So it's about, so I'm probably gonna have us close up around 1:45 my time, 4:45 time, other people's time, right? Just to be on everybody's stuff and let the folks know where we're at. Yeah, so actually this might be a good question for us to end on. And what I want to say, actually, what I appreciate about this panel is that I think in so many different spaces we might speak to people or share, like all of us have done speaking in lots of different types of contexts. And usually it takes so much time to get into the really deep stuff and the heavy shit because you're just warming up to people. You're like, oh, these are strangers. And so what I've appreciated about us all on this call is like, we've, I don't know if everybody knows everybody, but we've interacted in some sort of ways, and just being able to be present with people that I've seen and been a part of doing the work with on multiple levels. I feel like we were able to jump into some serious shit kind of quickly, and I just value just everybody's vulnerability. The last question I have for us all is, in the best possible case scenario, what do you hope the world is like a year from now and 10 years from now? Right, because especially as those of us that are organizers, those of us that are theorists, those of us that are creating work and talking and making art in all the different ways, right? We're building towards a possibility, and what do we actually hope that possibility is?
It's oh my goodness, it's like, whoo, child, that, I mean, that question is so ooh, child, because it's, I mean, gonna take a miracle, right? Like for the type of world that I have imagined, right? Which is, I think, is possible now. But I mean, I think everything that we've kind of shared as a collective on this panel of what liberation looks like, what pleasure looks like, what autonomy looks like, is what I, you know, want the world to look like. I want the world to be that liberation is the first thing that we think about, and not the thing that we only think about because oppression exists. I want a world in which everyone is able to have agency and autonomy. I want a world that actually values lives over production and products. I want a world in which people are able to reconnect not simply with the land, but also their ancestral lines. I want a world that is free of white supremacy, and I want a world not only free of white supremacy, but a world in which white supremacy is thought of as so disgusting that we are willing to stamp it out the minute that we experience it or see it. Yeah, that's, you know, a year from now or 10 years from now, I want a world in which, you know, Black, trans, and non-binary babies are embraced by their communities, all their communities, including their cisgendered siblings, and are protected and loved and cared for, and are allowed to tap into that ancestor being that is beyond binary. That's just like a little bit. That's just like, you know, a little bit. If we need somewhere to start, let's abolish the police. Let's abolish prisons. Let's have a universal basic income. Let's allow for people to actually live up to not just their highest potential, but to actually invest in their gifts and allow for their gifts to do what their gifts are supposed to do, which is be a gift to us and make us better beings. Yeah, that's what I think.
I think the only thing I will add to that is reparations for Black people. Everything else is a go. Everything else, reparations for Black, that's the only thing I'm adding. But everything Lady Dane said, everything.
I definitely, yeah, reparations would mean that unhinging of the kind of anti-Blackness that the civil world relies on. So I would hope that we're not living in the same mess where we're having to, you know, people are having to work themselves to death, just like our ancestors worked themselves to death, and or were killed. And I just, you know, I would like to consider a possibility of like of really living, and of you know, having that kind of direct respect for autonomy and individual and collective autonomy and mutual aid. I think mutual aid right now is really popping off, because like people are realizing that like, oh, we can actually like organize with each other in like non-hierarchical ways without like the state or without even money, you know, like and what those possibilities are very exciting to me. And yeah, I would just hope that we're at a point where like, you know, industrialization hasn't gotten to the point where we gotta be buying like our air quality, you know, in order to live. Or yeah, I just finished also reading Parable of the Sower, and that I've read it before, and like I feel like how much more relevant is it now, with like getting back to the land and like learning all the things that you need to do to survive. And like, who better to know how to survive than the people who have experienced the end of the world before, the end of their worlds before, you know? So, you know, keep it tight. Like I would say, just like keep it tight. Yeah, reparations to end America, reparations to stop this, you know, perpetuation of this kinds of slave, you know, the afterlife of the slave plantation, and like the sentiments that it has held forward. But that's pretty much it.
Listen, I can't, yeah, I don't think I can add anything else to what y'all already shared. I think that piece that you just shared, especially at the end, Etsy, about, you know, so many of our folks have already experienced the end of the world, right? So I think I was watching this with you. Was it the, what was it? The Girl with All the Gifts. The Girl with All the Gifts, right? So we watched that movie like 5 million years ago, right? And
yeah.
So for those of y'all that didn't watch this movie, it's a zombie movie. If you like some good Afrofuturism, you know, spoiler, not spoiler, but the Black girl lives, which is important, right? But at some point during the movie, she says to this white woman, you know, it's not that the world is over, it's just not yours anymore, you know? And so I'm hoping for worlds in here in 10 years, right? In which it is the norm for people in pain not have to explain their pain to other people to be believed, or to have to like give up more of their time and energy and sweat and tears and labor to other people just to get what they need, right? That we are immediately believed, that we immediately get what we need, and that wrongs are immediately corrected. So that's my hope that that there will be an empathy movement, a consensus, and understanding that to be that people that perceive themselves only as that white people that get to see themselves as analytical will stop telling that lie. It will actually give way to space where we actually center people who are being consistently targeted and put in pain and who are being robbed from. So that's my hope for the world. Yeah, and so with that, I want to thank Etsy, I want to thank Erica, I want to thank Dane, I want to thank our tech teams, I want to thank Victoria, Aja, Maeve, everybody who's been doing stuff behind the scenes for us today. I want to thank the Northeast LGBT Conference Board for allowing us to work with y'all this year. If y'all want to find out about myself and Dane's work around the Black Trans Prayer Book, people can hit us up on the Instagram. We love the Instagram. You can also check out the book that we both read from yesterday, the Black Trans Prayer Book, at theblacktransprayerbook.org, theblacktransprayerbook.org. Yeah, and you can find more about Erica, Etsy on their websites as well as on their Instagram. So I know, yeah, so you can check out some more of their art, more of their talking spaces. Please check them out, bring them to your campuses digitally or in person, depending on what's going to happen. We all know what's going to happen, but we all here and we present for it, right? So you can bring them to where you are. And this was just such a blessing. So thank y'all again. So as three people again that I cannot say this enough, that I deeply love, admire, and learn from every time I'm in y'all's presence, and I'm in y'all's presence a lot. So y'all, like, I learn every single motherfucking day of this life.
Me too.
Blessing. Just thank y'all for joining me today. And yeah, and we'll see y'all all on the interwebs sometime soon.
Appreciate you. Love you.
Hey, y'all, love you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Bye, y'all. Go fuck some shit up.
Listen, fuck all shit up, okay?
Wear your personal protective equipment.
Yes.
Distance when you're on the streets. I know it's hard, but like try to keep the distance.
Yes.